Our presenter is Anthony Papalas, Ph.D., retired history professor, and he was at ECU from 1970 to 2010, about 40 years, and he's been retired about 3. So here's Tony Papalas to speak on Galen's place in the history of medicine.
Let me begin by saying something about ancient medicine. I'm not going to attempt anything like a full-scale review of the history of Greek and Roman medicine, but I simply want to establish a context for the career of Galen. The recorded practice of medicine begins with civilization, roughly 3000 BC. There are medical texts from the first civilizations of Mesopotamia, but eventually Egypt emerged as the pioneer in medical practice. The Edmund Smith surgical papyrus, I'm not crazy about using the name Edmund Smith because it's confusing, but there is a practice among Egyptologists to name important documents after the collectors who purchased these documents. I would have preferred referring to this document as the surgical papyrus. But anyway, it's known in the profession as the Edmund Smith surgical papyrus, and it provides instructions on treating broken limbs, and it appeared at an amazingly early date, around 2900 BC, right at the dawn of civilization. And there are things in this papyrus, in this document, which are very close to Hippocrates. The library, in fact, here, the Lapis collection, has the folio volume of two big volumes of the Edmund Smith work. Now, it is the first of several Egyptian medical text, but it is the best. And thereafter, as Egyptian civilization progresses, the medical texts become less scientific, become more or less a hodgepodge of witchcraft and some science. Of course, it's always an amazing thing, or ancient historians are always amazed at Egyptian history in that it flowers very early, almost at the beginning, and then it starts going downhill, unlike Greek civilization, so to speak. But despite the limited approach of Egyptian medicine or its deterioration, Egyptian doctors remained renowned throughout most of antiquity. For instance, when neighboring civilizations wanted a doctor, they would write to the pharaoh. We have in the archives of Amarna, that's a collection of letters and documents that were kept in the city of Amarna around 1550. We have requests, say, from the Hittites for an Egyptian doctor. Homer praises Egyptian doctors. So Egyptian medicine reigned for most of the classical world. In fact, the practice continued well into the 6th century. Darius, the king of Persia, who had conquered Egypt or ruled over Egypt as well as much of the ancient world, had Egyptian doctors at his court. Then something remarkable happened. Darius decided to fire his Egyptian doctors. He had suffering from a dislocated ankle, and they weren't able to reduce it. And he hired a Greek, a man named Democedes, to reduce a dislocated ankle. He succeeded, and then he became court physician. The Egyptian doctors were fired. They disappeared. Lucky they were not executed, as a matter of fact. And Democedes then removed a cyst from the queen's breast. So at this point, Greek medicine becomes dominant in the ancient world, and it'll retain its position for the next until practically the 19th century because of Hippocrates. A generation after Demosthenes, Hippocrates began his career. I have the dates and the spellings in that little handout that you have there. Unlike Demosthenes, Hippocrates left a written record, the so-called Hippocratic corpus. And his methods established a medical tradition that lasted over 2,000 years. In fact, surgeons of the Civil War here in the 1860s, they were more or less practicing Hippocratic medicine. Hippocrates purged medicine of religious and superstitious elements using rational elements. Epilepsy, for instance, had been regarded as a disease sent by the gods, the sacred disease. In an essay titled The Sacred Disease, Hippocrates wrote that epilepsy was not connected in any way to the gods, but it was a disease with a rational explanation, and concludes that any doctor or any medical practitioner who made references to the gods in treating epilepsy or any disease was a mountebank. So this was an important and major step in the history of medicine. And all of this thinking and this medical ideology is encompassed in the Hippocratic corpus. It's a miscellany of 70 essays. Of course, the best known are airs, waters, places, regimen and acute diseases, prognostics, and so forth. It's most conveniently available in the Loeb edition. Those are 10-volume Loeb edition. It's a published by Harvard bilingual edition, Greek and English. The Hippocratic corpus was produced by Hippocrates and his sons, grandsons, and other doctors. Of course, it's very difficult to distinguish what was genuine Hippocrates and what wasn't, but there is more or less an official Hippocratic corpus. The works were collected on the island of Kos, where Hippocrates established his medical school. Around 300 BC, a rival medical school emerged in Alexandria, Egypt. Alexander the Great had conquered Egypt in 335 BC, and for approximately the next 300 years, Egypt was under the rule of Greek kings called the Ptolemies. Ptolemy II was perhaps the most interesting of the lot. Well, you might say Cleopatra, the last one, was the most interesting, but let's Ptolemy, for his cultural and scientific achievements, certainly stands out. But for our purposes, what made him so fascinating, he lifted certain taboos. For instance, the Greeks did not perform autopsies because it was considered a violation of religious principles. But Ptolemy lifted these taboos against dissection of the human cadavers, and he allowed doctors to perform autopsies. In fact, he may have even, there is a tradition that he provided live criminals for vivisection to the doctors. And two of these doctors, Herophilus and Erasistratus, I have their names and dates on the handout, apparently benefited a lot from having this sort of material available. Peter Green, who is here in the audience, who's written the key books on Hellenistic civilization, thinks that this practice, he doesn't discuss vivisection, but autopsies existed only in this short period, and thereafter they came to an end. And I think that is more or less the common belief that performing autopsies was not done, and Galen, despite being the leading anatomist of the period, of the later period, never performed an autopsy. Now let us consider Galen, the subject of this lecture, who was the most famous doctor in the Hippocratic tradition. And if you enumerate the top 5 doctors in Western civilization, he would be up there in that category. Let me first begin with a biographical sketch and then discuss briefly his medical practices. Galen was born in 129 AD in Pergamum, a Greek city along the coast of Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. At that time, it was part of the Roman Empire. Galen's medical works are replete with autobiographical asides. He writes that his father, Nikon, a wealthy architect and a man of moderation, generosity, and kindness. He loved his father. He detested his mother, from what little we gather in these references scattered throughout his work. For instance, in one of his essays on infectious bites, here he talks about how dangerous human bites can be, and he refers to his mother, who, when she became angry, would bite her servants. She also had a terrible temper. She would harangue his father constantly, as Galen says, as Xanthippe, the wife of Socrates, would berate Socrates. Nikon advised his teenage son to study philosophy and literature. By the way, that was the way in antiquity to get ahead. If you studied the humanities, you would get a good job. I think I should point this out to Governor McCrory, that some people had very different ideas about how to get ahead in the world. And by the way, he was a very accomplished in literature, and he was considered a writer and a lecturer. And when I first ran across his name way back in my graduate school days, that's what my primary interest in him was, as a literary figure, not as a doctor. Now, the best doctors in by the way, I skipped a line, but his father had a dream that his son should become a doctor, and at this point, Galen began to study medicine, locally at first in Pergamum. The best doctors were associated with the temple of Asclepius. Asclepius was the god of medicine, and there was some legitimate medical services being provided at the temple. Of course, it was alongside priests who also would indulge in some medical religious hocus pocus, but that was a very minor activity. It was basically rational medicine, and there he learned from these doctors, and he also studied in neighboring cities. And when his father died, he left ample funds for him to complete his education, and he went to Alexandria, which had become a medical center, mainly because of the works of this man Erasistratus that I mentioned, and who's on your handout. Now, although Galen became, like Erasistratus, a great anatomist, he preferred the works of Hippocrates, who had no tradition in anatomical studies. Indeed, Galen revered Hippocrates as infallible, and he dedicated his medical career, almost his life, to advocating the principles of Hippocrates, and in fact, purging the Hippocratic corpus of works that he thought were spurious. In fact, Galen wrote a number of commentaries on Hippocrates, which survived. Too bad no works of Erasistratus survive. We really don't know much about him. Mainly, what we mainly know about him comes from Galen, who wrote 2 books attacking Erasistratus. Now, around 157, Galen completed his studies, and he returned to Pergamum, and he applied for a job to be the doctor, public doctor for gladiators. Hence, you have that poster, which has been very effective. I see it's drawn a surprisingly large crowd today, and I have to thank whoever made that poster for doing that. Well, now I must explain that the Greeks didn't go in that much for gladiatorial combat. It was a Roman institution. But in certain Greek cities, it had become a practice, particularly where a lot of Romans were living. So there was a public gladiatorial institution there, and Galen applied for the job to take care of these gladiators. He passed an oral examination, and then he also gave a public demonstration eviscerating a live Barbary ape and then putting it back together. He could do this better than anybody, and that was one of his ways that his career really took off. Now, Galen got the job, and he boasted, and of course, that was one of Galen's problems. He was always attacking his rivals and other doctors, and he was not a very popular man. He boasted that before he became doctor to the gladiators, the wounded combatants were dying at a high rate. He gives the figures. But after he got the job, in the first year he only lost 2, and then in the succeeding 2 years, he didn't lose a patient. So he apparently saved the city a lot of money because gladiators were extremely expensive. He also adds that the job provided him with a window into the body. Unlike other doctors, he saw a lot of unusual wounds very early in his career, and he certainly gained a lot of practical medical knowledge from this. Another benefit from the job was the animals that he was able to get his hands on. Gladiatorial contests always had an animal hunt at some point, and they would bring in a number of animals that were unusual. And so Galen and his students, after the match, would go out and into the arena, haul off the animals, and you take them to his laboratory. He claimed that he dissected apes, horses, asses, mules, cows, camels, sheep, lion, elephants, wolves, dogs, lynxes, various kinds of birds, and so forth. In 162, he went to Rome, went to the big city to become famous. He had already published some medical books, and he had established a medical reputation, and he was eager to build on it. When he arrived at the city, he gave public lectures on medicine and also demonstrations, which chiefly consisted of the vivisection of apes. And he became kind of a sensation in the city for his skill in doing this. He boasted, no doubt with good reason, that his dexterity in dissecting live animals could not be emulated by any rival. He also disparaged his colleagues, stating that there were only 5 good doctors in the city of Rome. By the way, this kind of information comes from various works. It doesn't have one autobiographical work. It's scattered throughout his writing. We are not surprised to learn, as he reports in several of his essays, that when he would give a display in an auditorium on vivisection or a lecture, the auditorium had many of his enemies there ready to hector him during his performance. Now, no doubt contempt was a normal reaction from the established medical community toward an overambitious provincial doctor on the make in Rome. But they had never encountered a man with such an ego, such drive, and perhaps intelligence. Galen's aim was to become chief doctor of the emperor and the preferred physician of the Roman aristocracy. Wealthy Romans generally employed a team of doctors who gathered around the sickbed and often quarreled bitterly about treatment strategy, confusing the patient, who in some cases died unable to make up his mind on which recommendation he should follow. Of course, these teams of doctors can be very destructive, and Dr. Porres, in a lecture I attended a couple of years ago, talked about how the team of doctors attending President Garfield were more or less responsible for his death. One tombstone from this period reads, "Here I rest, thanks to my team of doctors." So Galen was going to try to break through that tradition, and he describes his experience with such a team attending a feverish aristocrat. He simply took command and stated, "All of you are wrong." And he then prescribed another form of treatment. It was accepted, and it proved to be effective. He doesn't name the individual that he was treating, but it must have been a very important person, because this opened up a lot of doors for him. Another occasion, he was consulted. He was brought in to consult with a senator who had fallen off his horse and was suffering from numbness in his right fingers. The other doctors in the team were smearing the fingers with ointment, but Galen, upon learning that the man had fallen on his back and hit the ground between his shoulders, treated the area in the back, and that cured the numbness in his fingers. Of course, he had performed so much vivisection with live animals that he, knew anatomy better than any of his rivals. In a third case, Galen cured the wife of a certain Boetius. He'd been appointed governor of Judea. She had a problem, an enormously distended stomach, and it seemed he treated her. He describes the treatment. Doesn't sound all that sophisticated, but in any event, he cured her, and he received 400 gold pieces, a huge gold coins, a very huge fee. And so Galen was taking these cases from other doctors, from very wealthy clients, and they were referring to him, according to Galen, as Wonder Boy, Miracle Man, and obviously there was a lot of bitterness directed toward him. On one occasion, he had a chance encounter on the street with a rival, and they began a shouting match, and it basically consisted of shouting quotations from Hippocrates. And Galen would correct his rival by saying, "You're quoting from a spurious work." So, now it's hard to sort out the chronology of all these quarrels. I'm sure somebody's going to do it. By the way, I'm surprised, and I'll comment on this later, that no one has written a book on Galen, his life and times. They just focus in on one aspect, but they don't take this whole the whole thing into consideration. But these quarrels apparently took place during his first stay in Rome, when he was still a very young man. And obviously, just judging from what he himself writes, he was making a lot of enemies. People didn't like him, and perhaps for good reason, too. He provides enough information about himself to more or less condemn himself on this issue. A friend informed him that a doctor named Papalas, another Greek doctor, all the important doctors in Rome were Greek at that time, was conspiring to kill him. So this got Galen's attention, and he let it be known that he was going to go on a vacation on the Italian countryside. He left Rome and discreetly made his way to the east coast, to the port of Brundisium, got on a boat and took passage and went back to Pergamum. So he left. He doesn't explain fully why he left, but you can. I think there's enough there, evidence there that he took the threat seriously, and he might have been assassinated. He returned to Pergamum and enjoyed his immense library, which he had not taken to Rome. He practiced his dissecting animals, and he published some books. In 167, he returned to Rome. He doesn't say why he made that decision. My guess is that some of his enemies died off, or they were no longer important, and he felt it was safe to return. And he aspired to become the chief physician to Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, the philosopher emperor, one of the great emperors of Rome, who ruled from 161 to 180. And it seems that he planned to settle in Rome permanently at this time because he transported his huge library, brought it to the city, and almost immediately he received a summons from Marcus Aurelius. He describes it. It's one in his insights that he has of living in Rome and what it was like, these firsthand accounts of being a citizen of the Roman Empire. He received a summons from the emperor with a seal on it. He opened it up, and Marcus Aurelius asked him to report immediately to his military camp and to prepare to accompany him in a campaign against the Germans in the north. Now, this was not the sort of appointment he was expecting. He didn't want to leave Rome, and friends of Galen explained to him, look, the emperor, he had not yet met him, was a very fair and mild-mannered man. In fact, that's what he was. I mean, he was he has a reputation of being perhaps the most reasonable king of all time, close to Plato's philosopher king. Galen reported to the emperor that Asclepius, the god of medicine, warned him in a dream that he should not accompany the emperor. Marcus listened to it very respectfully and said, well, if this is what he told you in the dream, then I can't go against it. You certainly can stay, but you'll have to look after my young son, Commodus, who was a teenager and bent on hell. Commodus turned out to be the worst of emperors, whereas his father was the best, and apparently he did take care of him. He got him through one health crisis. For this, Galen doesn't get much credit from historians. Now, some scholars will cite this incident that he was a physical coward, that he didn't want to do his duty and go off to the front. But it's more likely that Galen wanted to continue his medical studies and medical research, and he was a researcher, really. And it would have been impossible for him to do this in a military camp on the Danube. When the emperor returned, Marcus Aurelius joined the emperor's medical retinue and even described one incident, specific incident, where he treated the emperor who was having spasms. I'm not sure how it was effective, apparently, but it seems like a pretty simple remedy. Prescribing a peppered wine, whatever the pepper he meant by that, and also he placed a wooden pad soaked with some balm on his chest, and he massaged the patient's feet, and this seemed to work. And after Marcus died in 180, his services were sought by his son Commodus, and then the next emperor, Septimius Severus. These men were notorious tyrants who arbitrarily executed senators, and it's therefore not surprising to see in Galen's works that many of his patients were senators that he was treating for stress. So, I haven't seen this used much in the narrative histories, but in fact, because Galen hasn't been read much until just recently. During his second sojourn in Rome, Galen continued his research in anatomy, dissecting animals. Of course, he didn't do autopsies on humans. And he discovered, perhaps restating the finds of Erasistratus, that urine comes from the bladder and that many spinal cord injuries result in paralysis. But one of the interesting things about Galen is he constantly expresses wonder to the Creator for figuring these things out and providing such perfect solutions for the human body. He was a very pious and a very religious man. And for this reason, you see very positive references to Galen in the early Christian writers. Now, Galen, in an interesting book, How to Select Good Doctors, that book I reviewed back in the 1980s, and it's not in the corpus, the standard corpus of his works, because it was lost, but it comes from an Arabic translation, and the copy I have is bilingual Arabic on one side, which of course I can't read, and then English on the other side. But it's a fascinating book because it deals with the practice of medicine. And he makes a point saying, look, if you want to hire a doctor in Rome, you have a problem because it's a big city. People don't know one another. If you're living in a smaller city, you know who the good doctors are and who the bad doctors are, but that's not the case in Rome. So you have to, and of course doctors weren't accredited. There was no accrediting agency. This is what really bothered him the most. There was no official way to license doctors. So he says, it's up to the patient himself to make the decision to find out who's good and who isn't. And he said, he particularly criticized rich people for making mistakes in selecting doctors. And so he said, you have to read Hippocrates. You have to study Hippocrates to know how to evaluate doctors, and you have to pose the following questions. Bring your doctor in and say, in what books did Hippocrates deal with certain diseases? What are the differences between Hippocrates and Erasistratus? What are the diagnostic values of the pulse, urine, stool, and tongue? If they can't handle these questions, don't hire them. Now he said, rich people in Rome were too busy, the wealthy class, pursuing wealth, pursuing power. He said a few had intellectual interest, a very small minority, but they were interested in remote literary subjects or very obscure historical topics, and they didn't, perhaps what we're doing here today, but and they didn't pay enough attention to what was more important, medicine. He said, knowing doctors and knowing something about medicine, that's the most important thing that you can know. He therefore said that what wealthy people are doing, generally hiring doctors who are hanging around their house. If you're a very wealthy man and you can pay large sums for medical services, you can open up your door and there are going to be doctors waiting out there full time to treat you. And he said, wealthy people are hiring doctors because these people are available and they're obsequious, and that is the worst criterion for making the selection. Now, gladiators. He began with gladiators, but they were not considered athletes. Though later on, Galen did have athletes as patients, and he wrote several books about athletes. One thing he didn't particularly like about athletes, he complained about their high salaries. Even in antiquity, they were very well paid. But he said also they didn't know how their health, despite the fact that they would train excessively, was rather poor. And he criticized athletic trainers who were producing these types of people and who in fact were posing as doctors. And so he had a separate book on that particular topic. He thought athletes were overdeveloped. And he doesn't specify what athletes he means, but I think he was aiming at the so-called combat sports, boxing, wrestling, and a sport called the pankration, which is like mixed martial arts, a combination of both. And since the Greeks did not separate boxers and wrestlers in weight categories, but just in age classifications, boys and men, it was the bigger you are, the better you are, and so these people would bulk up and they tended to look like sumo wrestlers, as we can see from vase paintings. And Galen pointed out how they would have strokes at an early age. They couldn't perform just average tasks like taking a long walk. So he said if you want to, he recommended exercise, but light exercise, nothing heavy, nothing nearly as strenuous as what the fashion was becoming to build up bulk. Now, Galen also was interested in medicine and herbs, and he listed 440 different plants with medical properties, out of which he made 250 medicines. These drugs, he thought, restored the balance of the four humors. He believed, as Hippocrates, that there were four humors, black, yellow, bile, phlegm, and blood, and these had to be in balance. So he energetically collected plants throughout his life, and on one trip across the Aegean, he had the captain of the boat stop at the island of Lemnos so he could collect the red soil, Terra sigillata, which he thought was an antidote to poison. Now, medieval medical schools had courses on Galen's drugs and pharmacological knowledge. And in fact, when Marcus Aurelius went on his campaign, the one that he got out of going on, he provided him with a medicine called theriac, which consisted of 64 ingredients, one of which was juice from the poppy plant. So we can guess what that was all about. Now, it was under the influence of theriac that Marcus Aurelius produced his great work, the Meditations. And I was very much impressed with that when I first read it, because I knew the context in that book. Context of the book. He was here on the frontier, very difficult conditions, losing some major battles. While back home, he had reports that his son was uncontrollable, that his wife was having an affair, and yet he seemed to be very peaceful and imperturbable, and quite philosophical in his outlook. So I think that state of atarataxia, which he had gained, imperturbability, came somewhat from that medicine that Galen had prescribed. Now, he writes about what we would call psychology. He would call it ethics. That goes throughout his work, and he feels that people are born with a fixed personality, and you can't really do much to change it. Commodus, for instance, the son of Marcus Aurelius, had the best education, a wonderful father, yet he turned out to be a terrible man, despite all of the fine teachers that he had. On the other hand, he knew the slaves of a individual who had been condemned by the state. The slaves were put to torture, trying to make them provide information against their master, and the slaves would not submit. They would not testify against the master. And so he said, it doesn't matter what status of life you are, you have a fixed personality. Education can't do much about it, or even birth. But I ran across one interesting incident, slightly disturbing, about his reaction to things. He was traveling with a friend and through Greece, and his friend lost his luggage, or an important item in his luggage, and he became furious with his servants. And he took out his sword. He meant to use the flat part of the sword to hit him, but accidentally hit him with the sharp part of the sword, the blade of the sword, and inflicted serious injury upon these people. And the man was overwhelmed with guilt, and he rushed into Galen's tent with a whip. He says, please, he says, whip me for what I have just done. Of course, it sounds like a scene from Dostoevsky, doesn't it? But Galen didn't understand that this man was driven by guilt, and he just laughed at the man's reaction, and he said, and he gave him a big lecture on anger. You know, you shouldn't get angry, and you know, who knows, you might wind up hurting yourself when you do something like this. So he does seem to be a bit obtuse on these matters. Now, at the end of his life, Galen was visiting a bookseller. In fact, he often hung around bookshops in Rome, particularly looking for manuscripts that were old, several hundred years old. He was collecting these sort of things. And he witnessed a dispute in the bookshop between a bookseller and a client over one of his own books, or supposedly one of his own books, on Galen's views of medicine. And the customer thought it might be a spurious book, and the bookseller was saying, no, this is genuine. Of course, it was spurious. Of course, it's interesting that they didn't recognize Galen. Here he is, he's a very important individual, but in the Roman world, they didn't have television, newspapers, people weren't photographed, and so unless you were the emperor and because you had your picture on a coin, you were not, people didn't know who you were. But as a result of this encounter, Galen thought, well, I better write an essay on my books. And so he wrote a bibliographical essay on everything that he had written, so he could distinguish between genuine works and spurious works. And he also used this incident as a means to collect his work, some of which he had lost. Servants, he claimed, stole some of it was lost in a fire, and so he was able to bring his collected works together. Now, and this probably is this last-minute effort that he made, one of the reasons why 22 volumes of his work have survived. Now, Galen, in some ways, was not. It's surprising that he is not well known or mentioned much by his contemporaries. Marcus Aurelius doesn't mention him in his meditation. A friend of Marcus Aurelius, who wrote a number of letters about intellectuals would have survived, a man named Fronto, doesn't mention him. The two great historians of the period, or historical sources of the period, don't mention Galen. So we are somewhat surprised at this. Maybe he was so disliked that there was an attempt to forget him once he was gone. But a century and a half after he died, around 360, a doctor named, and I have his name on the handout, Oribasius, who was a friend of Julian the Apostate. He was a doctor, and he was also an intellectual, very much along the lines of Galen, collected his works and cited his works off, and thus I think this is what preserved Galen's works. Now, let me conclude. Galen, therefore, was a main source, Galen and Hippocrates, in the medical schools of the Middle Ages, fundamental reading for doctors. His reputation suffered a little bit in the 16th century when Vesalius published, who held the chair of surgery at Padua, published a book on the structure of the human body. Vesalius performed autopsies, and it turned out that Galen got it wrong on a lot of things because animals aren't the exact equivalent of human beings, and so people were operating on some false premises. Nonetheless, despite this problem, Galen still remained important enough to, in the beginning of the 19th century, a man named Kuhn, a classicist and a professor of pathology at the University of Leipzig, published 22 volumes of Galen's work. They're bilingual volumes, Latin on one side, Greek on the other. But these volumes were published for doctors. So he was still considered a very important source. And, I'm sure some Civil War doctors who were amputating during, the 1860s were using these things. And in the 1830s, a complete edition of Hippocrates came out in France by a man named Littré. But just as this project was finished in 1862, Pasteur's germ theory came out, and suddenly Galen and Hippocrates are no longer considered important sources for the medical practice. They had a long run, a couple thousand years, but now we're in a new era. Hippocrates survived better than Galen because of his ethical pronouncements, his ideals. He was still an important part of the Western tradition. His books the Hippocratic corpus continued to be read. Of course, doctors took the Hippocratic Oath, where Galen was pretty much forgotten until I think the 1950s. There was a mild interest in him, and then it picked up pretty big in the 60s and the 70s. And the specialists who read Galen, I'm by no means a specialist, there are 8 to 10 who are very familiar with all of his works. They don't like him too much. They see him as a windbag, a physical coward, a low character, a hypocrite. He had no friends, no disciples. He bragged a lot, took high fees while he recommended a simple life. He endorsed the ethical ideals of Hippocrates, but were never any references in his work to helping out the unfortunate. But I think this is probably too harsh. I think they're overlooking the man's drive and his commitment to medicine. He lived in an age when there was no certification for doctors, and therefore charlatans flooded the profession. He considered that he was on a heroic mission to rescue medicine from the decline that it experienced from the days of Hippocrates, and to keep it on a high level. And I, at this point, prefer to think of him in those terms. Thank you very much.
I am Joe Cholovich from the Biochem department.
Right.
Some years ago, I read a book called Melancholia. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's
what was it?
Melancholia,
No.
Early History of Medicine. But they talk about the great accomplishment of Hippocrates
Right.
is being that when there were several possible treatments, that he would use astrology to decide among the different treatments.
Right.
And that was considered his major place. I was wondering if you came across anything like that.
No, I'm not familiar with the work, but I would like to look into it. I mean, of course, Hippocrates came along at a time when there was a lot of pressure to apply superstition and this hocus pocus. This was the basic thrust of medicine, and he stood up very much against it and had a tremendous influence, not only on medical practice, but just in the way people assessed life in general. Thucydides, the great historian who was a contemporary of Hippocrates, just looked at things cause and effect. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on it?
Right.
That's good.
Anybody else? Any other hands?
Yeah. Yes.
Just a simple question, Waldemar de Rijk from Dentistry. You say he was at the bookseller, but since printing wasn't around at the time, what was a normal number of copies that he would write?
Oh, well, that's a good point. That's an excellent question. And sometimes there's only one copy of a book. Sometimes he wrote a copy of a book for a friend. They wanted, it would be a book, we would call it more like a pamphlet or an essay, and he would send it, and then he would lose track of it. And he would say, oh, I wrote that to my friend, and maybe I'd like to get a copy, I'd like to get it back. But on the other hand, booksellers did have copyists, and they would produce these books to make money, but we don't have, we just don't know. That's a good question, and I'm sure there's a lot of speculation about it, but the total copies of books out there, or when he wrote something, I don't think he was concerned with that until the end of his life. And then he saw that some people were claiming his books and putting their names on them and things like that. And so he, by writing that interesting bibliographical essay, the first time I think anybody's ever done that, he was trying to control that. But circulation of books, interesting question. I don't know, my colleague Peter Green knows more about it than I do.
Actually, I was going to say the publication of books is not in the sense publication as we know it today. It was much more, except in the fact that it was far more often on demand. I mean, to produce any book meant copying the entire thing out by hand, so book publication was immensely expensive. And the tendency, as I say, was just simply to publish on demand, and very frequently, this is why books got lost. I mean, you know, there was, Heraclitus did one copy of his book and kept it in a temple for safety. Mm-hmm. So it was, to get lost was very easy, and copying was not easy at all, and as I say, very expensive.
Yes, Dr. Papalas.
John Papalas, your son. In the Edward Smith papyrus, there is, I guess, and maybe in Egyptian medicine, there was a tradition where a certain set of treatments would be described, and then for some diseases or injuries, the final treatment would be do nothing.
Right.
If things didn't work, you would just simply give up, and that was it. It seems like nowadays, at least in Western medicine, there's this idea, there's this notion of something has to be done, something can always be done, and I think it really kind of affects the way we as a culture view death and dying, perhaps. Right. Was there ever, I guess, an equivalent in Greek and Roman medicine where they would accept that nothing could be done, as opposed to praying to a god or seeking astrology? I mean,
right. That's an interesting question. Hippocrates, as a matter of fact, describes a leg falling off from gangrene. You know, it does nothing, doesn't amputate or anything like that. So I think, I think there was a tendency to, at least in the Hippocratic approach.
because it seems to almost be counter that.
If you don't turn the microphone.
Business.
Right. Oh, right. Yeah, that's what Galen says, that doctors were quite willing to tell a patient, a wealthy patient, anything just to please him and make money. I mean, in some cases they would say, well, look, I think what you need to go out and, drink 10 glasses of wine tonight and have some dates, go out on a date, and you'll feel better, because if they knew that the person had a voluptuous nature, they would recommend something along those lines. But good doctors would, I think, in the Hippocratic tradition, would do what you suggest. They would say, we can't help.
Well, not to be political or anything, but I predict that potentially with the implication, or the Affordable Care Act now cutting spending, we may see more and more physicians admitting that they can't do anything with more limited means.
Right. Yes.
When Galen was around, that was about the beginning of the Great Plague, the Antonine Plague.
Right.
And he couldn't do much about it.
No.
And he wrote very little about it.
Well, that's an excellent question, actually. When he returned to Rome the second time, he ran into the plague, and he panicked. And he was living in a particular city, and he left. He mentions the plague. Now, I don't know if he did. There are 22 volumes out there. I don't know if anyone has read all of that stuff. I mean, but he did mention the plague and that he had to get out of town. Interestingly enough, he was aware of the fact that he seemed to suspect that it was contagious. But he was in a city called Aquileia, and people were dying, and he just left. But I thought about the issue of the plague too. That was a big phenomenon during his lifetime, and I probably should have said more about it. And I don't know really enough about what his reaction to it. But you would think that he would have written about it. I'm sure he did somewhere. By the way, I gave just a little bibliography there in that handout sheet. But if you get into some of these books, like the Cambridge Companion to Galen, and you go back and there's about 10 pages of bibliography. A few years ago, there would have been less than a page, but I bet there's something there, and I'm going to look into that tonight because you piqued my interest in that. issue.
Because he left such an extensive written record, would you expand maybe a little on this? It seems to speak toward the importance of mentoring for him.
Well, the written record, I think, has something to do with his interest in literature and writing, and he was trained originally as a rhetorician. And that's when I first came across him. His name is part of a literary movement in the 2nd century AD called the Second Sophistic. And so for him, expression was very important. And in fact, his success had something to do with his ability to express himself, to persuade people that he was a good doctor, and also to write. And so it was, but he was a workaholic, obviously. He worked in his laboratory, he had patients, he wrote all this stuff. I don't think anybody's ever worked harder than him. I mean, he just, and he talked about staying up all night, reading the ancients and things like that. He was driven. And he lived to be, in his late 80s, or early 90s, but he considered himself a writer as much as a physician. And the 22 volumes, by the way, that's only 2/3 of his work.
Walter Sapiston, I'm a surgeon, and I'm interested in Galen because of anatomical terminology.
Right.
Some consider him the father of anatomical terminology,
Right.
at least. But my question for you really is, the information on Galen that comes through the Arabic.
Some of it, not all of it, just some of it.
How valid is it in comparison to Kuhn and people
Right.
such as he?
Well, Kuhn doesn't have the Arabic stuff.
No,
I mean,
no, I
yeah, I mean, there are 6 to 7 tracks that were lost, and Kuhn didn't have those. And they've just surfaced in the last 20 or 30 years. And so I have no way of knowing how valid, I mean, we have no way of knowing if the Arabic translation from the Greek was accurate. And then, of course, I can't access the Arabic into the English. But it's out there, we have it. It's an interesting question, is it not, that the Arabs at one point in Western civilization were more interested in the Greek classics than they were in Western Europe.
But Arabic in medicine actually was a little later than the Greeks in terms of their proficiency and so forth.
Oh, sure,
and
sure.
anatomy.
I mean, if you were living in Europe in, say, the 12th century, and you had money and you had a problem, you were going to try to see an Arabic doctor, not someone from Western Europe. As a matter of fact, they were the Arabic Islamic civilization was far ahead of European civilization. And then and somebody wrote a book about that, said what went wrong. So.
Anyone else?
Well, I just have a comment. Hi, Tony.
Hi, Megan.
Megan Perry in Anthropology. There is one section that I found of Galen that's been translated into French that talks about the plague, and I actually have it scanned, so I'll give it to you.
Oh, interesting. I'm sure there is.
Yeah,
I'm
but
sure,
it's scattered and it's. I don't think it's complete.
I'm sure I could. That gentleman's curiosity could be settled, and I'm sure he did deal with it at some point.
Anybody else? Well, again, thank you for coming.